really, really exciting to be here this morning with you all. Such a fabulous group, an event that we've been working up towards for a long time in the Transformative Adaptation WhatsApp group. It's been mostly virtual so far, and we're still virtual here today because of the pandemic. But I feel like it's a really good group. It's the group that's supposed to be here. And hopefully it's the start of something pretty special and pretty major. And that's what I'm hoping to introduce in the next 10 minutes or so. Let me say right away that this talk that I'm giving here this morning is obviously a very brief one. If you want a longer version of this, if you want to know more and hear more in detail and hear more discussion of the kind of thing that I'm going to be doing in a very encapsulated form now. We did something along those lines a couple of months ago and recorded it, and I'll put the link to that in the chat in a moment. Are we now recording? Yes, okay, good. Yeah. I'm now going to just put in the chat a brief overview of what I'm going to do in these 10 minutes. So 4 questions. What is transformative adaptation? Why is transformative adaptation necessary? Where does it come from? And where is it going? I hope that's kind of self-explanatory. I'm now going to attempt to share my screen, but I'm completely unfamiliar with how to do this on Zoom, so this may go wrong. Let's see if I could share my screen. Share. Okay. No, I'm not sure this is going to work. It's asking me to open my system preferences and all that nonsense. Forget about it. It's there in the chat. Yeah, so what is TRAD? Why is TRAD necessary? Where does TRAD come from? Where is TRAD going? So first question, what is transformative adaptation? So as I say, if you want a longer answer to this question than I'm about to give, then, well, the first thing to do is to make sure you've read the documents which we've circulated. And hopefully everyone has read those. We're sort of taking for granted that you've read at least one of them. Do so afterwards if you haven't yet done so. Here in the chat is the link to the talk that I gave with other people present also speaking, including Chris Taylor brilliantly, a few months ago, where we go into that in greater detail. But briefly, we can get an initial sense of what transformative adaptation is by counterposing it to the alternatives. So when discourse around climate became a big thing in the academic world and beyond a generation or so ago, people spoke about climate mitigation as the #1 task, i.e. the mitigation, the making less bad of the harms that greenhouse gases are doing in our atmosphere, etc., by reducing them. People thought about that as the #1 task, and then they said, well, then there's this other thing, this sort of poor relation to it, adaptation to the harms that actually occur. And for a long time, adaptation has been the poor relation. It's had a kind of poor reputation because people have said things like, oh, well, if we focus too much on adaptation, then no one's going to do the mitigation, and focusing on adaptation is sort of giving up. And so adaptation has had only a tiny amount of the attention and only a tiny amount of the money that mitigation has had. And the form that adaptation has mostly taken so far, insofar as it's taken any form at all, is what is sometimes called incremental adaptation, or to be a bit negative about it, as I like to be, in the form it's been in so far, the very inadequate form it's been in so far, shallow adaptation. And this kind of adaptation is exemplified by suggestions such as, well, if the sea level rises, we'll just make the seawalls a little bit higher. And basically, incremental or shallow adaptation is adaptation which is designed to keep the system going as it is, to stop there being any need for system change, to respond in a purely defensive way, and in a way, by the way, of course, that makes the problem actually worse, because doing things like building seawalls is very carbon intensive, to the difficult, horrible situation that increasingly we are in. At the other end of the scale, many of you will be familiar with the concept of deep adaptation. So what's the difference between transformative and deep adaptation? Well, you can focus the difference around this, that deep adaptation tends to presume, and certainly in the way it was initially presented by Jem Bendell, does presume that collapse is inevitable. Societal collapse driven by ecological decline is inevitable. Now, I should say that deep adaptation doesn't have to presume that. And I'm actually working on a book with Jem Bendell in which we're talking about deep adaptation as something which is necessary, as I strongly believe, and I'm sure many of you do, is necessary, at least as a kind of insurance policy. In other words, we can't rule out that collapse may come. If we think collapse is likely or even possible, then we ought to be doing deep adaptation. And that's the basis on which I'm working with Jem on this. So I'm all in favor of deep adaptation. But I think that deep adaptation isn't enough. And in particular, it tends not to be positive enough, especially as it is unfortunately somewhat associated with Jem's own hunch that collapse is inevitable. So transformative adaptation keeps our options open and keeps us in a space of unknowing and says, look, no matter what the future is going to bring, let's have a sort of no regrets policy of doing the kind of stuff, the transformative stuff that we need to be doing, that we want to be doing anyway. Transformative adaptation will be the right thing to do if society heads towards collapse. It will be the right thing to do if society manages to avoid collapse. It's the right thing to do. Couple more elucidations of what transformative adaptation, of how it can be seen. When I talk about it with policymakers, with people in government and so on, because transformative adaptation is for every level. It's not just for local action, it's for every level. It should happen internationally, nationally, locally, at the neighborhood level. And I talk about it with policymakers, etc. I talk about it as strategic adaptation. I say this is the kind of adaptation that you would make if you were being strategic about the situation. And one final way of seeing it, systemic adaptation, as already implied. Transformative adaptation is about system change, which incremental adaptation never was. As I say, it ought to happen at every level. It ought to be what we demand, what we insist upon if our demands are not met. In other words, what we co-create. And that's a lot of what I think we're about here in this group. So that's my first question. What is transformative adaptation? Second question, why is transformative adaptation necessary? Well, I've already kind of given you some hints, and I'm sure that you're all well up to speed. It's too late now to forestall climate and ecological decline. It's happening. We've seen it, especially in the last few years. And it's baked in to get worse in the coming years. Whatever we do, however much movements like Extinction Rebellion succeed. It's baked in because of time lags in the system. It's baked in because the system is so slow to change. And it's baked in, unfortunately, because we're starting to get some feedbacks kicking in, which are going to make it really hard to stop climate decline. So adaptation is necessary because it's too late for a mitigation-only approach. And what we need to have is a vision of adaptation which works well hand in hand with mitigation, which transformative adaptation does. And so transformative adaptation will be visible. For example, if I return to my example of seawalls earlier, transformative adaptation will be visible in things such as restoration of biodiverse wetlands, restoration of mangrove swamps, if you're looking at other parts of the world, ways that we have of working with nature rather than against nature, of moving in the direction we need to be moving in anyway, of a sort of more nature-based way of living, being closer to nature in the way that we live, and simultaneously mitigating as we adapt. Transformative adaptation is necessary because it is too late to forestall decline and damage. It's happening. We have to face that reality and get with the program. That's my second question. Third question, where does transformative adaptation come from? So in response to the unsatisfactory incremental adaptation ideas, which have been around for a while, some years ago, people in the United Nations and some academics came up with the concept of transformational adaptation. And, you know, it's got a respectable pedigree, that concept, in the UN and in the academic world. My view, when I came across this material several years ago, is it's just such a great name, you know. I just love the sound and the meaning, and I think many of us do, and that's why we're here, really, of transformative adaptation. It brings together what we need to do, adaptation, with a beautiful and brilliant sounding way of doing it. So what my think tank and I decided to do some years ago, my think tank Greenhouse, is to radicalize transformational adaptation. We called it transformative adaptation. And you can read about that story if you want to do so in this book, Facing Up to Climate Reality, the Greenhouse book on transformative adaptation, edited for us by my colleague, John Foster. And you can find that, for example, via the Greenhouse website. Facing Up to Climate Reality puts forward a vision, a radicalized vision of transformative adaptation as systemic, as strategic.
Rupert, could I just give you a time reminder, please?
Yeah. What does that hand mean?
It means a couple of minutes, perhaps.
Right. Yeah. Transformative adaptation came from that academic and UN context. It started to take more form through Greenhouse and in the Facing Up to Climate Reality book. And it's now taking form in this group, in the documents which we've drafted, and in particular, perhaps in the declaration, which we'll come to later on in the day. And that leads to my fourth and final question: where is trad going? And really, I don't have a lot more to say about that right now, so I can finish in about a minute, because the question of where trad is going is down to us, right? The declaration sets out a suggested direction of travel. This could become a very big thing. Let me put that another way. This will become a very big thing. It is absolutely certain that in the 2020s, this will be a wave. This will be a wave fit for our time, because it will become more and more obvious to more and more people that we have to adapt, and that if we are going to adapt, then we have to do it, that we have to do it in a transformative way, not a shallow way. The straws in the wind are increasingly clear. The 2020s, the decade in which we see clearly, will be a decade in which transformative adaptation rises. The only question is how much, how fast, how well, and through what institutional or organizational form. And that question is a semi-open question, which I hope we will address today. So that's my provisional answer to where transformative adaptation is going, that it's really going places. Where exactly it goes and how exactly it goes, that's up to us.